Here are 5 essential opening traps that can help you skyrocket to a 1500 rating and possibly tilt your opponents into a fury. Master these sneaky tricks and watch your rivals crumble in frustration. The first trap happens in the French defense, and that's why we are playing as black. At this stage, you are already putting pressure on your opponent's pawn on e4, and in most cases, they will push it forward, entering the well-known advance variation. You then challenge the center with pawn to c5, and when white supports it with pawn to c3, you continue with knight to c6, adding more pressure to the central pawns. Sooner or later, your opponent, especially if they're not an experienced player, might play bishop to b5, aiming to pin your knight on c6 and relieve some of the tension in the center. Alternatively, white might first play knight to f3, to which you respond with knight to e7 or knight to f6, and then they go for bishop to b5. Once they pin your knight, you play bishop to d7, pretending to calmly break the pin. Now, the most common move by white is to castle kingside, thinking that everything is proceeding as usual. But here comes the surprise. Knight captures on e5. This move may seem completely out of nowhere, but it reveals a devastating discovered attack, catching your opponent completely off guard. So, if white captures your knight on e5, you simply recapture their bishop on b5, hitting their rook on h1, and you come out with a clearly superior position. On the other hand, if they instead capture your bishop on d7, you don't have to worry about losing the knight on e5. You just retreat it back to d7 and then grab the pawn on e5. Your opponent has been completely outplayed and you've gained the upper hand. Now, let's say white goes for the queen's gambit. In that case, you can respond with the aggressive Alban counter gambit, a must-know trap for every improving player. After pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and then pawn to c4, you strike immediately with pawn to e5. They takes, your push the central pawn on d4 and blocks white's knight on b1 from developing naturally. Many players will be tempted to play pawn to e3, hoping to trade pawns. If black captures here, it might seem like a blunder, since white can exchange queens, force your king to move, and go into a favorable endgame with an extra pawn. But here's where the trap is sprung. You ignore the trade and instead play bishop to b4, delivering a check. This is the famous Lasker trap, named after the second world chess champion, Emanuel Lasker. Even though this tactic is well over a century old, players still fall for it constantly. White is now forced to block the check. Once they do, you surprise them by capturing the pawn on e3. Thanks to the pin on the diagonal, white cannot capture the pawn on e3 with their bishop, as it's pinned, and if they take with the pawn, they end up with doubled and weakened pawns. Plus, they must deal with threats like queen to h4 check. Either way, white is in trouble, and you've gained a powerful advantage. Now, naturally, if your opponent isn't familiar with the Lasker trap, their first instinct will likely be, wait a second, what about this hanging bishop on b4? They may think you've simply blundered a piece. But if they take the bishop on b4, the real surprise begins. Instead of immediately recapturing their queen on d1, you throw in a powerful intermezzo. Pawn takes f2 check. This sudden check forces white to deal with their exposed king, and only then do they realize they're in serious trouble. If white had captured the pawn on f2 earlier, they now see that their queen on d1 is left completely undefended. After the check, you'll simply take their queen, and it's game over. Now let's say white tries to be clever and defends their queen by moving their king to e2. That looks solid, but here you hit them with a shocking move. Rook captures knight on g1. Not only is this legal, it's the best move in the position. You've just turned white's knight into a tactical liability. Why is this so strong? Because you are capturing with check, meaning white has no time to grab your queen or fix their position. If they try to recapture with the rook, you follow up with bishop to g4, piling on the pressure and exploiting their exposed king. At this point, white's position collapses completely. Even if they keep their composure and decline to capture the knight on g1, they still have to move their king, and by then your pieces are fully active, while theirs are undeveloped and tangled. This is how a seemingly harmless idea turns into a devastating tactical trap. At this point, it's already too late for white. You play queen to h4, checking the king. The knight on e5 still covers the e2 square, cutting off the king's escape route. White often tries to block the check with pawn to g3, but then your queen slides to e4, creating a devastating double attack, targeting both the rook on h1 and the vulnerable king. On the next move, you grab the rook, and somehow, in just a few precise moves, you've managed to infiltrate deep into enemy territory, capturing both the knight and the rook, while launching a crushing assault on the white king. Now, let's look at the next classic and absolutely essential trap, this time against the Sicilian Defense. As white, you go for the aggressive Smith-Morra gambit, sacrificing a pawn early in exchange for rapid development. After pawn to e4, pawn to c5, and then pawn to d4, you're inviting black to accept the gambit. Black takes, and you recapture with the knight. Here's where many players hesitate with knight to f6, realizing that as soon as they play that move, you can strike with pawn to e5, kicking their knight backward and gaining more space. To avoid this, most will first play pawn to d6, reinforcing the e5 square and opening up the diagonal for their bishop. You continue your rapid development with bishop to c4, pointing directly at the f7 pawn. Now, if black finally plays knight to f6, thinking the position is safe, you hit them with pawn to e5, forcing their knight to retreat. Here's the trap. If black dares to capture the pawn on e5, you immediately strike with the tactical shot bishop takes f7, a classic deflection sacrifice. The king is forced to move, and then you follow up with queen takes d8, snatching the queen and securing a winning position, and we're not done yet. The next trap flips the tables on a common trickster move and will leave your opponents stunned. In this one, white plays the seemingly innocent queen to f3 early in the game. At first glance, it may look like they're going for the old scholar's mate, but what comes next will surprise even the most prepared players. At first glance, queen to f3 looks like a beginner's move, aimed at a quick scholar's mate. Surprisingly, though, it's actually the second most played option in this position, even ahead of solid developing moves. Your opponent hopes you'll carelessly respond with something like bishop to c5 or knight to f6, allowing them to continue their setup, or maybe even deliver a cheap checkmate. But here's how you turn the tables. Instead of defending the pawn on f5, you push it forward boldly with pawn to f5, inviting your opponent to capture it, either with the queen or the pawn. Most will grab it with the queen, stubbornly sticking to the checkmate idea. Now you strike back with knight to f6, eyeing pawn to d5. This opens threats like knight to d4, hitting both the queen and the pawn on c2, and also prepares to recapture on f5 with your bishop, giving you active play. Back to the main trap, if queen takes f5, your opponent may think you've blundered, but you respond with pawn to d5, offering yet another pawn. Greedy opponents will often capture it, unaware they've walked straight into a trap. But now it's too late. Pawn to d5 was actually a double attack, targeting both the queen and the bishop. Your opponent is bound to lose one of them. Still, many will stubbornly capture the pawn, clinging to their checkmate fantasy. But instead, you calmly take their queen, flipping the game entirely in your favor. Let's move on to another must-know trap, the famous Blackburne-Schilling Gambit. It starts with knight to c6 and then knight to d4, offering the pawn on e5. Experienced players might think, everyone knows this trick, but surprisingly knight takes e5 is still the second most popular response here. Even those who suspect a trap often fall back on simple passive development, and that lets you equalize or even seize the initiative. If white greedily takes the pawn on e5, it seems like they're gaining space and attacking. But you strike back with queen to g5, threatening both the knight on e5 and the pawn on g2. If they try to stay aggressive with knight takes f7, forking your rook and queen, you don't panic. Instead, you respond with queen takes g2. Now the rook on h1 is under attack and must move. If it does, you continue with queen takes e4 check. The e2 square is covered by your knight, so white can't block the check with their queen. If they try to block with their bishop, you finish the game with a beautiful and unexpected checkmate.